He was charming enough to walk into your home, patient enough to wait until you trusted him, and precise enough to make sure you never woke up. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. This story was created through long hours of careful research, reflection, and attention to detail. Every part was placed deliberately to build an immersive experience while honoring the weight of these real events. The purpose of this channel is simple: to preserve these stories and ensure they continue to be remembered. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the park that swallowed men whole. The case of Fortunato Bottinetto, aka the Trianon Maniac, the devil who smiled at dawn. Douglas Baptista, aka O Maniaco de São Vicente, the São Vicente Maniac. Now let's begin. Sao Paulo in the 1980s was a city that never slept, never whispered, and rarely looked down. It was a city drunk on ambition, draped in neon, suffocating under the weight of its own noise. Paulista Avenue, the glittering spine of Brazil's most powerful city, pulsed like a living creature every single night. Wealthy men in tailored suits walked past gleaming storefronts. Jazz drifted from open windows. The smell of coffee and cigarettes threaded through the thick, humid air. Everything felt alive. Everything felt electric. But tucked just behind that electric surface, in the shadowed greenery of Parque Trianon, a quiet, elegant park sitting directly across from the Sao Paulo Museum of Art, something else was alive, something patient, something that studied the wealthy men who passed through the park's tree-lined pathways after dark, something that smiled warmly, spoke smoothly, and extended a hand that felt like safety but was, in every sense of the word, the last hand those men would ever hold. His name was Fortunato Bottinetto. He was young, muscular, attractive, and entirely terrifying. And for 3 years, from 1986 to 1989, he moved through Sao Paulo's most privileged circles like a ghost dressed in skin, leaving behind a trail of bound bodies, emptied apartments, and a city too afraid of its own secrets to scream for help. Tonight, we are telling his story. Not to glorify, not to sensationalize, but because the truth of what happened in those darkened apartments deserves to be spoken aloud, clearly, completely, and without flinching. This is the case of the Trianon Maniac. And when you understand what he did and how he did it and how long the world simply looked away, you will never hear silence the same way again. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There is a particular kind of cruelty that hides itself inside a compelling face. It borrows the language of warmth, the gestures of tenderness, the posture of someone entirely unthreatening. It moves through ordinary life without triggering alarm. It learns how to be liked before it decides to destroy. Fortunato Bottinetto was that kind of cruelty, wrapped in youth, wrapped in muscle, wrapped in a smile that men paid for and ultimately died trusting. He was born on the 10th of September, 1963, in the city of Sao Paulo, a sprawling, relentless metropolis that was itself a contradiction, a place where extraordinary wealth lived in the same breath as devastating poverty, where ambition and desperation occupied the same street corners. Sao Paulo never slept, it never softened, and in many ways, neither did the boy who grew up somewhere in its vast and indifferent shadow. By most external accounts, Fortunato's early family life was not defined by violence or deprivation in the conventional sense. His household was described as religious, and those who spoke of his family described them with a kind of quiet decency. But something in the formation of Fortunato Bottinetto went wrong, profoundly, irreversibly wrong, long before the first body was ever found. He was slow to develop language, not speaking until he was 5 years old, which in a household that placed value on appearances and respectability must have drawn its own quiet shame. He struggled in school from the moment he was enrolled, struggled not only with the academics themselves but with the social architecture of classrooms, with sitting still, with following rules that felt foreign and suffocating to a mind that processed the world differently from those around him. He ran away from home repeatedly. He dropped out of school without completing his education. He drifted, and it was during that drifting that the damage already done to him, damage buried deep and rarely spoken of, began to shape everything that followed. Fortunato later confessed, with the kind of flat, unadorned specificity that made investigators deeply uncomfortable, that when he was 8 years old, he was sexually assaulted by a truck driver. He was a child. He was small. He was powerless. And that powerlessness, that brutal violation of his body and his sense of safety at an age when the world should have been nothing but open and wide, carved something inside him. It carved a rage he would carry for the rest of his life. A specific, targeted rage directed at those he perceived as physically stronger, socially superior, and untouchable. He had been made to feel beneath them. He had been made to feel like something to be used. And the memory of that, the heat of that humiliation, never fully left him. As a teenager, he came to understand that he was attracted to other men. In 1980s Brazil, this was not simply a personal truth. It was a social liability of enormous proportions. The country was gripped in a climate of fierce conservatism layered beneath its flashy surface. The AIDS epidemic was beginning to spread terror across communities, and the dominant narrative, repeated in churches, in newspapers, in government corridors, was that gay men were responsible. They were diseased. They were dangerous. They were to be feared and despised. Fortunato grew up breathing that atmosphere. He absorbed it, and what it did to him was both predictable and catastrophic. He began offering his body to older, wealthy men who were drawn to his muscular physique and youthful energy. On the streets and green spaces near Paulista Avenue, he became known by the nickname Pilo, a name he wore like a costume among his clients. He was personable. He was discreet. He knew how to read a man's needs and reflect them back with enough warmth to generate trust. For a period, this was enough. He moved through the twilight economy of São Paulo's underground, exchanging intimacy for money, building a clientele among some of the city's most educated and professionally accomplished men. Doctors, artists, academics, theater directors, men of culture, men of means, men who lived alone in clean, well-furnished apartments in São Paulo's most desirable neighborhoods, men whose lives were organized and private and deliberately concealed from public knowledge. But São Paulo in the late 1980s was shifting. The AIDS crisis was worsening. Fear was spreading not only across communities but within them. Clients who had once sought Fortunato's company became more cautious, more reclusive, more terrified of exposure. His earnings dwindled. His clientele shrank. And as the money dried up, the crack cocaine, which he had begun using and which consumed roughly 2 grams of his daily existence, became both more necessary and more expensive to maintain. He began petty theft. He began low-level robbery. He told himself it was temporary, a bridge across a difficult season. But bridges, once crossed, rarely disappear. And for Fortunato Neto, what began as theft very quickly revealed itself as something far darker, far more deliberate, far more permanent. He was not a man who suddenly snapped. That is the narrative that gets attached to killers because it is more comfortable, because it implies an accident, a loss of control, a single catastrophic rupture that explains everything. Fortunato did not snap. Fortunato planned. Fortunato observed. Fortunato selected. He studied his targets the way a craftsman studies a material before he begins to work it. Patiently, methodically, without hurry. He identified men who were wealthy enough to have things worth stealing. He identified men who were isolated enough that their absence might not be noticed quickly. He identified men who were, by the very nature of the era they lived in, unable to easily report what happened to them. Because reporting would mean exposure, and exposure in 1980s São Paulo carried its own devastating consequences. He found his hunting ground at Parque Trianon, and he used it with a surgeon's precision. The park was, in those years, a known gathering place for gay men seeking connection in a city that offered them almost no legitimate, safe, or public venue for that search. The tree-lined paths and shadowed benches became a geography of longing and danger simultaneously. Men came there looking for warmth in a cold social climate, and Fortunato stood among them, young and striking and entirely available, the perfect predator in the perfect position, invisible because he looked exactly like what he was pretending to be. His method was refined early and deviated very little. He would meet a man in the park or in the vicinity of Paulista Avenue. He would arrange a private engagement. He would accompany his target back to the man's own apartment. Always the victim's apartment, never his own, always somewhere well-furnished and private and away from curious eyes. Once inside, he would drink with his target. He was sociable, he was relaxed. He was everything a man hoping for a pleasant evening could want. He would encourage the drinking. He would refill glasses. He would wait. When the alcohol had done its softening work, when his target's guard had lowered and his body had grown heavy and his movements had slowed, Fortunato would begin. He would undress his victim. He would bind the man's wrists and ankles, sometimes with electrical wire, sometimes with sheets stripped from the very bed they lay upon. He would secure them to the bed frame, methodical and unhurried, betraying none of the violence that was coming. And then he would change. The man who had been charming and easy and warm would become something unrecognizable. The smile would flatten. The warmth would drain from his eyes like water from a broken vessel. And what replaced it was something that seasoned investigators, hardened men who had spent careers inside the most brutal corners of human behavior, would later say chilled them in ways they could not fully articulate. He killed with his hands when he chose to. He strangled with ropes, with jeans, with nylon cord, with the casual efficiency of someone performing a task they found neither remarkable nor particularly difficult. He stabbed when the situation moved him to it. He used knives. He used a screwdriver. He used whatever the apartment contained that could puncture flesh and stop a heart. He would sometimes continue stabbing after his victims had already stopped breathing, a post-mortem violence that psychiatrists would later characterize as an expression of sadistic satisfaction, a need to extend the act beyond death itself. When it was finished, he would move through the apartment with a calm that was almost domestic. He would gather valuables, televisions, Walkmans, watches, checkbooks, Gucci bags, clothing, anything that could be converted into money or kept as a souvenir of the evening's work. He would dress himself. He would leave. He would walk back out into the city of São Paulo, back into the neon and the noise and the coffee-scented air of Paulista Avenue, and he would disappear. The apartments he left behind became sealed chambers of horror. And for a city already struggling with its own silence, those chambers would remain sealed far longer than anyone could have predicted or forgiven. The first body was discovered on the 7th of December, 1986. His name was José Liberato, though his friends and colleagues had always known him simply as Zizinho. He was 66 years old. He was a decorator, a man of aesthetic sensibility and professional achievement, someone who had spent his life arranging beauty within domestic spaces. He lived alone in his apartment, as many of Fortunato's eventual victims did, in the solitary but dignified independence that characterized a particular generation of São Paulo's educated, privately living gay men. He was not a man who shouted about his life. He was not a man who made demands on the city's attention. He lived quietly, beautifully, on his own terms, until he didn't live at all. When his body was found, it told a story of deliberate and methodical violence that had been given time, unhurried, undisturbed time, to complete itself. His legs had been bound together with a white bedsheet. His hands had been secured to his chest using electrical wire pulled from somewhere inside the apartment. A long scarf had been wound tightly around his mouth, sealing any sound that might have escaped. Around his neck, a length of nylon had been fastened with the kind of careful tension that left no room for doubt about the intent or the outcome. He had been asphyxiated. He had been stripped. And whoever had done this had walked out of his apartment leaving almost nothing behind. No prints of value, no witnesses, no clear trail that the investigators who arrived at the scene could immediately follow. The police took the case seriously. They documented it. They noted the particular choreography of the bindings, the deliberateness of the positioning, the evidence of a person who had not acted in blind fury but with controlled and purposeful methodology. They suspected, even then, that this was not the work of an amateur. This was someone who had done this before or had thought very carefully about how it should be done. But Sao Paulo was a city of millions, and its investigative resources were neither unlimited nor evenly distributed. The case was logged. The case was assigned. The case began its slow drift through the heavy machinery of a police system stretched far beyond its capacity. And in the absence of immediate breaks or witnesses willing to come forward, it quieted. Zizinho was dead. The world that had known him grieved in its own private way, and Sao Paulo moved on. 8 months passed. The city pulsed and heaved and exhaled its millions of daily dramas. And then, on the 17th of August, 1987, a second body was found. His name was Antonio Carlos Di Giacomo. He was a psychiatrist, a man professionally devoted to the architecture of the human mind, to understanding the mechanisms of thought and emotion and behavior. He held a position at a major medical institution in Sao Paulo, the kind of role that placed him among the city's most intellectually accomplished citizens. He was educated, he was respected, he was professionally distinguished, and he lived alone in his apartment in Villa Olympia, in a neighborhood that was modern and prosperous and entirely ordinary on its surface. What was found inside his apartment was neither modern nor ordinary. It was the evidence of an act of extraordinary brutality, sustained, deliberate, and almost theatrical in its escalation. His own socks had been forced into his mouth, shoved so deeply that they had reached his esophagus, a detail that medical examiners recorded with clinical precision and that investigators received with visible horror. Around his throat, a pair of jeans had been twisted and cinched with enough force to obliterate breath entirely. And after he was already dead, after his body had crossed the irreversible threshold, the killer had continued. He had stabbed Di Giacomo repeatedly in the chest, driving a knife into the region of the heart again and again, the wounds not serving any functional purpose but expressing something else entirely. Something that the forensic psychiatrists who later reviewed the case would describe as a requirement, a compulsion, a need to continue past the point of death as if stopping felt incomplete. Fortunato would later tell investigators what had driven him to kill the psychiatrist. The reason he offered was so mundane, so absurdly disproportionate to the violence it had generated, that investigators at first wondered if they had misheard him. Di Giacomo, he said, had complained that he smoked too much. That was it. Comment about cigarettes. A social criticism, the kind any person might make in the comfort of their own home to a guest they felt at ease with. And that comment, that minor, casual, entirely ordinary human observation, had cost Di Giacomo his life. It was a window into something that the psychiatric evaluation would later attempt to codify and name, but which resisted easy categorization. Fortunato's relationship to perceived slights was not that of a man with a short temper. It was something far more combustible, far more catastrophic. A psychological landscape in which the smallest perceived diminishment could ignite a response entirely out of proportion with anything a rational mind could process. He had been made to feel small once at 8 years old by someone who took something from him by force. He had never recovered, and every man who reminded him of that smallness, every man who corrected him, criticized him, dismissed him, underpaid him, became a proxy for a wound that had never healed. Shortly after the Di Giacomo murder, another death was added to the growing, largely invisible body count. Manuel Iraldo Paiva, known affectionately in theatrical circles as Manico, was a theater director living in the Consolacao district of Sao Paulo. He was a man of creativity and culture, someone whose professional life revolved around storytelling and human connection. He was found strangled in his apartment, his life extinguished in the same deliberate fashion as those before him. And from his home, his private sanctuary, the space where he had lived and worked and stored the accumulated possessions of his creative life, Fortunato had taken almost everything of value: a Panasonic television, a Walkman, a portable typewriter, multiple watches including a Mondane and a Gucci piece, a messenger bag, a checkbook, clothing, items that told the story of a life quietly and tastefully constructed, stripped away by hands that felt no weight in taking them. After these documented murders, at least 4 more followed in relatively quick succession, though the details of those killings were never fully released to the public. The investigations remained fragmented, the connections between cases slow to be formally drawn. And this slowness was not simply a function of investigative incompetence. It was a function of something more structural, more uncomfortable, more deeply rooted in the social architecture of 1980s Brazil. The victims were gay men. This was, in that era, a fact that carried immense and devastating consequence, not primarily for the investigation, but for the willingness of an entire community to engage with it at all. São Paulo's gay community in the mid to late 1980s was living under a particular kind of siege. The AIDS crisis had transformed public discourse about gay men into something deeply hostile. Newspapers ran articles that barely concealed their contempt. Religious leaders delivered sermons that characterized the epidemic as divine punishment for moral transgression. Politicians used the fear as political currency. And in this atmosphere, being publicly identified as gay was not simply socially difficult. It could cost a man his job, his family, his professional reputation, everything he had quietly and carefully built within the constraints of a society that did not particularly want him to exist. This meant that men who had survived encounters with Fortunato, men who had seen his face, heard his name, perhaps even escaped violence through luck or circumstance, were profoundly reluctant to bring those encounters to police. To report what had happened would have required explaining where they had been and why and with whom. It would have required exposing, in official documentation, a dimension of their lives they had structured their entire existence around concealing. The cost was simply too high for too many of them, and so they stayed silent. And the silence was deafening. And Fortunato Bottinetto walked back through the gates of Parque Trianon, night after night, year after year, and chose the next man from the dark. The police, for their part, were dealing with a problem that their existing frameworks had not been built to address. Connecting the murders required a willingness to look at the victims as a coherent group, to see the pattern across their individual tragedies, to treat the killings of gay men with the same investigative urgency granted to other victims. In a city the size of São Paulo, with a police force contending with extraordinary volumes of violent crime across its sprawling geography, the murders existed in a kind of administrative twilight. Documented but underconnected, registered but not yet assembled into the shape of what they actually were. And so, for 3 years, Fortunato Bottinetto operated. 3 years of apartments, of bindings, of silence purchased by shame. 3 years of a city that told its most vulnerable citizens, through every institutional and social mechanism available to it, that their lives were their own problem. 3 years of a predator who understood, intuitively, perfectly, that the best hunting ground is one where the prey cannot call for help. To understand what Fortunato Bottinetto did inside those apartments, you have to set aside the instinct toward abstraction. It is easier, when confronting acts of this magnitude, to keep them distant, to let them exist as headline language, as statistical notation, as the kind of compressed horror that can be processed quickly and filed away. But the men who died in those rooms deserve more than compression. They deserve the full weight of what was taken from them. And so we will sit inside it for a moment, as uncomfortable as that requires us to be. Fortunato's approach to killing was not impulsive. Investigators and the psychiatrist who later evaluated him both noted, independently, that his method showed a consistency and refinement that spoke to repetition and deliberation. He was not a man who arrived at each scene uncertain of what he was going to do. He arrived with a sequence in mind, a particular order of steps that he followed with enough regularity that police could eventually construct a profile of his behavior with some precision. The evening would begin in the park, or in the area immediately surrounding it, where the meeting was made and the arrangement negotiated. Fortunato was, by every account of those who encountered him in this context, entirely unremarkable in his presentation. He was physically attractive. He was conversational. He projected the particular easy confidence of someone comfortable in their own skin, someone who had navigated this terrain so many times that performing it had become entirely natural. He was pillow, charming, accessible, discreet. There was nothing in that first meeting that would have alarmed any of his targets. There was nothing that looked like danger. The walk to the apartment was normal. The entry was normal. The initial moments inside, the settling in, the social ease of two people establishing comfort in a shared space were normal. Fortunato would accept a drink. He would sit. He would talk because he was good at talking, because he had learned over years of this particular life how to make men feel that they had made an excellent choice. He would observe. He was always observing, noting the layout of the apartment, the location of valuables, the rhythm of the man across from him, the pace at which the alcohol was doing its quiet, cooperative work. When the moment was right, when his target's speech had thickened slightly, when his movements had lost their precision, when the ordinary social guardedness of a human being among another human being had softened into something closer to trust, Fortunato would begin the transition. It was apparently seamless. Men who were intoxicated enough to have their defenses lowered were also intoxicated enough to misread what was coming, to interpret the shift in the room's atmosphere as something it was not, until the bindings were already in place and the realization of what was happening arrived too late to change anything. He undressed his victims before he killed them. This was consistent across the murders and carried its own specific psychological significance, which the psychiatric evaluation would later address. It was not incidental. It was part of the ritual, a deliberate stripping of dignity, a reduction of the man to his most vulnerable physical state, a removal of the last social armor that clothing represents. They were bound. They were naked. They were entirely at his mercy, and he had none. The method of killing varied case to case, but the most frequent choice was strangulation. Hands around a throat or a cord, or a length of fabric pulled to a tension that did not relent. He had, in at least one case, stuffed socks so deeply into a man's throat that they had reached the esophagus before beginning the strangulation that completed the act. The detail is almost impossible to absorb without the stomach responding to it, and it was designed, whether consciously or instinctively, to be total, to leave nothing to chance, to be certain. In cases where he chose to stab, he used whatever the apartment made available. Kitchen knife, a screwdriver in at least one documented instance, a detail that the investigators who recorded it found particularly disturbing, not because they were unfamiliar with improvised weapons, but because it illustrated how thoroughly Fortunato adapted to his environment, how little he was deterred by the ordinary details of domestic space. What was in the kitchen became a weapon. What was in the toolbox became a weapon. The apartment itself became his instrument. The post-mortem stabbing was a feature that psychiatric reviewers found particularly significant. He would continue to stab after death, sometimes many times, sometimes with such sustained force that the body sustained wounds far exceeding what any biological purpose could explain. This was not practicality. This was something else. Something that required its own dark grammar to describe. A continuation of power over something that could no longer resist, an extension of dominance into the space after its ultimate expression. Forensic psychiatrist Guido Palomba, who examined Fortunato extensively before his trial, classified him as a sexual sadist, someone for whom the infliction of pain and the exercise of absolute control over another human being produced a specific and sought-after psychological gratification. The violence was not merely instrumental. It was, in its own warped and devastating way, satisfying. Some of the victims, according to accounts that emerged during the investigation and its aftermath, were subjected to violence of such sustained intensity that the injuries were catastrophic beyond the cause of death itself. Internal organs were ruptured. The body was treated as something that could be broken open, its interior made external through sheer applied force. These details are recorded not for shock, but because they are the truth of what happened, because sanitizing them erases the reality of what those men endured in their final moments, which is a disrespect they do not deserve. After the killing was finished, Fortunato would move through the apartment in a state that witnesses to his confession later described as eerily calm, unhurried, methodical, almost practiced in its rhythm. He would gather valuables. He cataloged them mentally and physically: electronics, timepieces, leather goods, clothing, checkbooks, anything that could be liquidated or used. He would leave the apartment clean of obvious evidence, closing doors behind him, stepping back into the city with the ease of someone returning from an entirely unremarkable evening. He would spend what he took. On crack cocaine, primarily, the 2 daily grams that had become both requirement and ritual. On food. On the basic sustenance of continuing to exist in a city that had no particular interest in his existence. And then he would return to the park. And he would wait. The question of how many men he killed in total is one that the investigation never fully resolved. He confessed to 7 murders when he was arrested. He was convicted of 3. Police believed, based on the cumulative evidence reviewed across the span of the investigation, that the real number was closer to 13. Though establishing that with the precision required for prosecution proved impossible given the gaps in reporting and the fragmented state of the case files. 13 families, 13 lives, 13 apartments that became crime scenes, and a park that stood in daylight looking entirely innocent, green and shaded and pleasant, a gentle green pocket of the city. While at night it held, in its shadows, the man who walked out of those shadows into the apartments of Sao Paulo's wealthy and educated and never came back alone. Fortunato himself, speaking about the killings after his arrest, did so with a composure that unsettled everyone in the room. He did not perform remorse. He did not manufacture emotion for the benefit of the investigators across the table from him. He described what he had done with the flat, informational effect of someone recounting a series of transactions. Here is what happened, here is the sequence, here is the particular detail about the implement used, and here is the reason, delivered without pause or apparent shame. He told investigators that most of the killings had been triggered by being underpaid. His clients, he said, would agree on a price and then offer less when the time came. And that short change, that small financial slight, would ignite something in him that had no proportion, no break, no ceiling. He was asked at some point during the investigation to describe what killing felt like. His answer made its way into the records of the case and eventually into the public consciousness of a country trying to make sense of what he was. He said that killing was like eating ice cream. When the first one was finished, the desire for another was already forming, and it never really stopped. Investigators sat with that sentence for a long time. Some of them still do. Serial killers are rarely caught through the investigation of their primary crimes. The architecture of their violence is too deliberate, too contained, too carefully engineered to leave clean trails that lead directly back to them. They are caught through the smaller mistakes, the moments of overconfidence, the departures from their own established patterns, the instances where the ordinary human impulsiveness they have otherwise suppressed breaks through and does something careless. Fortunato Bottinetto was no exception to this pattern. By 1989, he had been operating for 3 years. 3 years of apartments and bindings and stolen valuables and a park that kept his secrets. 3 years of a city that had not, despite the growing body count, managed to assemble the full picture of what was moving through its streets. He was emboldened, not necessarily in a way he could have articulated, but in the way that any predator becomes emboldened by continued success, by the repeated experience of acting without consequence. The act that ended his freedom was not a murder. It was an extortion attempt. A decision to threaten a 19-year-old student over money the young man had apparently taken from his car. It was a petty, impulsive, small-stakes confrontation that bore no resemblance to the careful, patient, ritualized violence of the murders. It was a blunder, the kind of thing that happens when someone who has built an entire criminal existence on controlled behavior stops controlling it, just once, just briefly, in a situation that does not feel consequential enough to require the full machinery of caution. The student reported it. The police responded. And Fortunato Bottinetto, who had passed through 3 years of Sao Paulo streets like smoke through a keyhole, was brought into a police station for what should have been a routine, low-level matter. But inside that station, something happened that no one had anticipated, and that would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. Fortunato, sitting across from officers who had brought him in on the extortion complaint, began to talk. Not about the extortion, about the murders. He confessed. He confessed voluntarily, apparently unprompted, apparently without any legal pressure that would later be used to challenge the validity of his statements. He laid out, with the same flat and detailed precision he would maintain throughout all subsequent questioning, the sequence of 7 murders. He named the victims. He described the methods. He walked investigators through the specific instruments, the particular bindings, the precise escalation of each individual act of violence. He was asked why he was confessing, and his answers were either philosophical or deeply disturbing depending on the psychological lens through which you viewed them. He described the killings as a kind of release, a correction of what he experienced as ongoing injustice, a response to a world that had consistently underestimated and underpaid and diminished him. The city of Sao Paulo received this confession the way a city receives a revelation it was already half expecting. With a complicated mixture of relief, horror, and the deep institutional discomfort of confronting how long it had taken to get here. Investigators who had worked pieces of the case over the 3-year span found themselves revisiting their files with new eyes, connecting the threads that had been there all along, assembling the full picture that the individual cases had only partially revealed. The profile that emerged was damning in its completeness. Forensic psychiatrist Guido Palomba was assigned to conduct the comprehensive psychological evaluation that would be required before the case proceeded to trial. His findings were thorough and unambiguous in their primary conclusions. Fortunato Bottinetto was a sexual sadist. He derived psychological gratification from the exercise of absolute power over his victims, from their restraint, from their helplessness, from the absolute and terminal nature of what he did to them. He also presented with a neurological profile consistent with epileptic episodes, periods of altered brain state that could produce explosive behavioral changes, shifting him from relative normalcy into something the people around him could not predict or manage. There was another dimension of Fortunato's psychology that Palomba's evaluation and the broader investigation brought into focus, one that added a particularly bitter layer to the tragedy of his victims. Fortunato was himself gay. He had lived as an openly gay man in certain contexts, had operated within gay social and economic spaces for years, had built his entire working life around sexual relationships with other men. And yet, during what investigators and psychologists characterized as his psychological breaks, those periods when the epileptic episodes or some deeper psychological rupture shifted his interior landscape, he became consumed by a virulent hatred of gay men. He blamed them in those states for the AIDS epidemic. He targeted them specifically, not in spite of belonging to their world, but because of some internally catastrophic relationship to that belonging. He destroyed the men whose world he shared, whose spaces he occupied, whose trust he leveraged, whose lives he had built his livelihood around, with a focused contempt that was all the more devastating for being so intimate. Palomba's professional conclusion was direct. If released, Fortunato Bottinetto would kill again. This was not a speculative risk assessment hedged with qualifications. It was a categorical professional judgment that the pattern of his behavior, the psychology underpinning it, and the absence of any therapeutic pathway that could reliably address what drove it made future violence not merely possible but probable. The sadistic gratification that killing had provided him had been escalating. The ice cream metaphor was not rhetorical. The desire had grown with each act, not diminished. Despite the confession to 7 murders and the police's broader assessment that Fortunato had likely killed 13 men across the 3-year span, the legal system could formally prosecute only what could be proven to the standard required for conviction. 3 murders, Liberato, Di Giacomo, and Pava, had sufficient evidentiary grounding to bring to trial. And it was on these 3 charges that Fortunato Bottinetto was ultimately convicted. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. 8 years. For the 3 confirmed murders of a 66-year-old decorator, a psychiatrist, and a theater director, 3 men who had been bound, stripped, tortured, and killed in their own apartments, whose homes had been looted by their killer, whose deaths had gone unconnected and unaddressed for years while their murderer continued to operate. 8 years for the confirmed horror, and no formal accounting at all for the remaining 10 killings that the police believed, and that Fortunato himself strongly implied, had happened just as surely. He was sent to Taubate prison in the state of Sao Paulo, a facility with its own particular reputation for grimness, for conditions that the penal rights organizations of the period documented with some alarm. He was not a famous prisoner in the conventional sense, not someone who attracted the sustained public attention or elaborate prison mythology of some other Brazilian killers. He existed within the walls of Taubate with a certain deflating ordinariness that was in many ways more disturbing than notoriety. He was interviewed by Veja magazine during the months following his conviction, a widely read Brazilian publication that gave him a platform that many felt he had not earned and did not deserve. In those interviews, he spoke with a range that investigators and victims' families found breathtaking in its casual audacity. He spoke of his travels to other countries. He described his personal interests. He bragged, without apparent hesitation or self-consciousness, about his high-status clients, men he characterized as reaching into the most elevated tiers of Brazilian society, from political figures to rock stars. He spoke as if the murders were a chapter already turned, as if the conversation he was now having about his vibrant and interesting life was simply the natural continuation of a story whose darker passages had been appropriately handled by the appropriate institutions and need not define the whole. He never offered anything that resembled genuine accountability for what he had taken from the world. Fortunato Botaneto died in his cell at Taubaté prison in February of 1997. He was 33 years old. The cause of death recorded by the autopsy was bronchopneumonia, a complication of the AIDS he had contracted, the same disease he had, during his psychological breaks, blamed the gay men he murdered for bringing into the world. There was no dramatic conclusion. There was no final confession of remorse, no public reckoning, no moment of clarity or accountability that the families of his victims might have held onto as a kind of closure. There was a cell. There was a deteriorating body. There was the quiet, unremarkable extinction of a man who had made his mark on São Paulo's history through acts of staggering violence and was now simply gone. The park still stands. Parque Trianon still sits across from the São Paulo Museum of Art, still fills with the ordinary traffic of people going about their ordinary lives, still shelters its paths in the same green shade it always has. If you walk through it in daylight, you would find it entirely pleasant. The trees are generous. The air moves through. The city hums at its edges. But some spaces hold their histories inside them, quietly and permanently, long after the events that shaped them have faded from daily conversation. And for those who know what moved through those paths in the dark hours of 1986 to 1989, for those who know the names of the men who trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment in a city that had given them no safe place to simply exist, the park is something more than green. It is a memorial without a marker. A story that needed, finally, to be told. And now, at last, it has been. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Angel of Death in a White Coat, the nurse who played God, aka the monster in Scrubs / the killer of Ward D. He tucked them in with gloved hands, watched their tiny chests rise and fall, and then made sure they stopped. There is a particular kind of evil that does not arrive with a snarl or a shadow. It arrives in soft-soled shoes, smelling faintly of antiseptic, with a name badge clipped neatly to its chest. It smiles at mothers in the corridor. It nods to doctors, carries a clipboard in one hand, and a syringe loaded with death in the other. That is precisely how Abreu Jose Bueno walked into the most vulnerable space imaginable, a children's hospital ward, and turned it into his personal theater of horror. The children in his care were already fighting for their lives. Some had leukemia, some had AIDS. They were aged between 1 and 10 years old. Their parents had placed every last fragment of their hope into the hands of the medical staff watching over them. They had no reason to fear the nurse. He wore the same uniform as the others. He spoke with the same calm authority. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that behind every resuscitation he rushed to report, behind every emergency he dramatically flagged, behind every near-death crisis he alerted staff to, was him. It was always him. He was not saving them. He was silencing them, then stepping back to watch the room erupt in chaos, soaking in the admiration like a man starved of it his entire life. Welcome to the case of Abreu José Bueno, the man who wore a healer's uniform while carrying a killer's intent. A story that will unsettle you long after the lights go out. Rio de Janeiro does not sleep quietly. It breathes in heat and noise, in color and contradiction. A city of extraordinary beauty pressed up against extraordinary suffering. In the shadow of that duality sat the Instituto de Puricultura Martigeo Gestira, a pediatric hospital affiliated with the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Known by its acronym UFRJ, the institution carried a reputation built on decades of medical service to the city's most vulnerable population, children. Small patients with enormous battles ahead of them. Families gripping the railing of hope with both hands. It was into this world that Abreu José Bueno arrived in 2003. On paper, he was exactly what the ward needed. A trained nurse, composed in presentation, attentive enough in manner to pass without question through the daily rhythms of hospital life. He spoke when he needed to. He worked his shifts. He filled in his charts. And for a period of time, he was unremarkable, a face among many faces in a hospital that never truly stopped moving. But something was burning beneath the surface of Abreu José Bueno that the fluorescent lights of Ward D could not illuminate. Those who worked alongside him in those early years would later describe a man quietly consumed by a need that no roster change or positive patient outcome could satisfy. He craved recognition, not the quiet, earned kind that builds between colleagues over months and years of shared labor. He wanted something louder than that, something that would make heads turn. Something that would make people look at him and see a man of consequence. What he lacked in natural authority, he began to manufacture through darkness. By 2005, Bueno had been assigned to a children's ward housing some of the most critically ill young patients in the facility. These were children already teetering at the edge, many fighting leukemia, a disease that hollows the blood and drains the body with merciless consistency. Others were living with AIDS, their immune systems barely functional, their frames tiny and breakable. These were not children who could withstand additional trauma. Their bodies had no reserves. Their systems had no buffer. They were, in the most clinical sense, profoundly fragile. And Abreu José Bueno knew exactly that. At some point in October 2005, the precise date has never been narrowed to a single moment. He made a decision that crossed every conceivable line that separates a caregiver from a predator. He selected a child. He drew up a sedative. He administered it not in the measured, prescribed dosage of a legitimate medical procedure, but in a quantity calculated to overwhelm, to suppress, to stop the lungs mid-breath and send the monitors screaming. Then he waited. The child stopped breathing. Bueno walked to the nurse's station and raised the alarm. What followed was the controlled frenzy of medical emergency. Doctors rushing, hands working, resuscitation equipment deployed, voices clipped and focused. And somewhere in that chaos stood Abreu José Bueno watching, not with horror, not with helplessness, with something that looked, to those who would later think back carefully on it, more like satisfaction. He had created the crisis. He had called the response. In his mind, he had positioned himself as the man who noticed first. The attentive nurse whose sharp eyes had caught what others missed. The man who sounded the alarm. The hero of the moment. It was a performance. Every part of it. And it was just the beginning. Over the course of October and November 2005, a window of barely 30 days, Bueno is believed to have targeted as many as 15 children. 15 small bodies in beds that should have been places of healing, turned instead into a stage for one man's catastrophic vanity. The method never deviated. The sedative, administered covertly, in doses that the youngest and weakest among them simply could not metabolize, would cause respiratory suppression. The child would cease to breathe. Monitors would trigger. Bueno would alert staff. Doctors would descend. Not all of the children survived the resuscitation attempts, for did not survive at all. For children, some as young as 1-year-old died. The deaths, in the initial days, did not register as anything beyond the grim statistical reality of a ward filled with critically ill patients. Children on that ward died. It was a devastating truth that the staff carried daily. So when a child stopped breathing and could not be brought back, the grief was real, but the suspicion was absent. These were sick children. Sick children sometimes died despite everything medicine could offer. That assumption, reasonable, humane, and desperately wrong, was exactly what Bueno was counting on. It took time for the pattern to surface. Time, and a growing unease that began to settle over the ward like something no one could name at first. Nurses noticed that the alerts seemed disproportionately linked to Bueno's shifts. Doctors began to register the uncomfortable frequency of near-fatal episodes occurring during his hours. The ward, which had always carried its sadness with professional steadiness, began to feel different, heavier, charged with something that no one wanted to say out loud, because saying it out loud meant accepting what it implied, that someone on the inside was doing this, that the danger was not in the illness. It was in the person walking the corridor with a clipboard, nodding good morning, adjusting the 4 stands with steady, trained hands. When that realization finally broke through, when the quiet suspicion gave way to formal alarm, the hospital moved. Internal reviews were initiated. Shift patterns were cross-referenced with incident reports. The picture that assembled itself from those documents was not one that could be explained away. It was damning. It was irrefutable. And it pointed with quiet, terrible certainty at one name, Abreu José Bueno. He was arrested on November 11, 2005. He did not go quietly into that arrest with any confession of remorse. He did not fall apart. He had spent months constructing a persona of competence and composure within those hospital walls, and even at the moment of unraveling, something of that controlled exterior remained. But the walls of Ward D had already begun to speak. The charts, the timelines, the toxicology that would come, all of it was already closing in. The man in the white coat had nowhere left to go. The city of Rio de Janeiro, when the story broke, could not process it in silence. It detonated through the press with the kind of velocity that only cases involving children can generate. The headlines were savage in their simplicity. A nurse, a children's ward, sedatives, dead babies. Parents of former patients began to wonder. Colleagues who had worked beside him began to reconstruct their memories with different eyes, searching for what they had missed, what they should have seen, what had been happening right next to them while they trusted him completely. The horror of that particular realization, that the threat had been within reach the entire time, had shared their space and their air and their break room, was something that many of those staff members would carry for years. The children of Ward D were not chosen at random in any strategic sense. They were simply present. They were the patients in Bueno's care during the shifts when whatever compulsion drove him had risen to a point he could not manage. But their specific vulnerabilities were not coincidental either. Children suffering from leukemia and AIDS are not children whose deterioration immediately triggers institutional alarm. Their bodies are already compromised. Their vitals already fluctuate. Their prognosis is already shadowed by uncertainty. For a predator operating within a medical facility, this created what investigators would later describe as a nearly perfect camouflage of opportunity. The sedative Bueno used, though the specific agent was confirmed through toxicological examination during the investigation, worked on the central nervous system with a particular brutality when administered in overdose to a child of low body mass and compromised immune function. The drug suppressed respiratory effort. The lungs, unable to sustain their rhythm, simply slowed and then stopped. For a child already weakened by disease, the margin between sedated and dying was almost non-existent. Bueno understood that margin. He was trained to understand it. His nursing education had taught him exactly where the threshold lay, and he crossed it deliberately, repeatedly, and without hesitation. The youngest confirmed victims were infants in the early years of their lives. 1 year old, 2 years old. Children whose entire experience of the world had been filtered through hospital walls, through the tired, loving faces of parents who drove themselves to exhaustion visiting daily, through the voices of nurses who became familiar in the absence of other constants. Children for whom the sight of a nurse approaching with clinical calm would have carried no fear, because nurses were the people who helped. Nurses were the people who made the pain stop. The perversion of that trust, in Bueno's case, is what gives this case its particular and lasting darkness. He entered those rooms as a familiar face. He performed the routine gestures of care, checking charts, adjusting equipment, perhaps speaking a few soft words. And then, when the moment aligned, he administered what he had prepared. Quietly, without drama, with the practiced ease of someone performing a standard procedure. The child would not immediately respond in a way that telegraphed what was happening. Sedation, even in overdose, does not produce instant visible collapse. There is a period in which the drug moves through the system, seconds, perhaps a minute, before the breathing slows to the point of clinical concern. During that window, Bueno could step away. He could be elsewhere in the corridor, tending to another chart, speaking to a colleague. By the time the monitors alarmed, he could arrive at the doorway with the expression of a professional reacting to an unexpected emergency. He had choreographed it. The word that investigators would later apply in interviews, in court documents, in the language that tried to make sense of the psychology driving his actions, was Munchausen syndrome by proxy. A term clinical in its construction but devastating in its implication. A pattern of behavior in which an individual causes or fabricates illness in another person in order to assume the role of rescuer or devoted caregiver. In Bueno's case, the motivation was not the warmth of perceived caregiving for its own sake. It was the recognition it generated, the professional respect, the sense of being needed and noticed in a high-stakes environment. He wanted to be the person other people pointed to and said, "He caught it in time. He's the one who noticed." He was willing to kill children to be that person. The 4 children who died were not the totality of his attempts. Investigation would piece together that approximately 15 children had been targeted across that single month, October through November 2005. Of those 15, 4 died. The remaining children who survived the respiratory crises they were pushed into, some of them successfully resuscitated, some who recovered from sedative overdose without the medical team fully identifying its cause at the time, had unknowingly survived an encounter with the person meant to protect them. The parents of those children, consider them for a moment. They had arrived each day to sit beside a bed. They had spoken quietly to their child, held small hands, watched monitors with the anxious literacy of people who had educated themselves in the language of hospital machinery because it was the only way to stay connected to hope. They had thanked the nursing staff. They had perhaps, at some point, thanked Abreu Jose Bueno specifically for his attentiveness, for catching something others might have missed, for being there. That thought, the thought of having thanked the person who had just nearly killed your child, or who had killed your child, is a psychological weight that does not lift. The investigation that built the case against Bueno was meticulous precisely because it had to be. The defense of coincidence, that the deteriorations occurring during his shifts were simply the statistical reality of a ward filled with critically ill children, was one that needed to be dismantled completely. Prosecutors needed toxicological evidence, shift logs, patient records, and the kind of pattern analysis that could withstand the scrutiny of a formal trial. What they assembled was extensive. The toxicological findings were central. The presence of sedative compounds in concentrations beyond any medically justifiable dose, identified through post-mortem examination of the children who had not survived, spoke in a language the defense could not reframe. These were not therapeutic levels. These were not the traces of prescribed medication administered at appropriate intervals. These were overdoses. Deliberate, targeted, lethal overdoses in the bodies of children between 1 and 10 years old. The shift records told their own story. The correlation between Bueno's working hours and the clustering of respiratory crises was not a pattern that could be attributed to chance. Statistical analysis of incident reports made the timeline visible and inescapable. The emergencies rose sharply when Bueno was present and dropped in his absence. For a children's ward with a stable, rotating staff and a consistent patient population, that variance was not medically explicable by any other means. Colleagues, when interviewed, began to fill in the texture of the picture. They spoke of a man who responded to emergencies with unusual composure, not the composed efficiency of the experienced professional, but something quieter than that. A watchfulness. An almost imperceptible investment in the outcome that differed from the collective urgency of those working to save the child. Some described a look they had not known how to read at the time. A look that made more sense in retrospect than they wished it did. Bueno, for his part, maintained the position that would become familiar in the aftermath of his arrest. The posture of a man defending against an accusation rather than confronting what he had done. He did not, in the immediate period following his arrest, offer the kind of detailed confession that would have made the legal proceedings shorter or the public's understanding fuller. He was a man trained in maintaining composure under pressure, and he applied that training even in the worst possible circumstances of his own making. But the evidence had already spoken. The bodies of 4 children had already spoken. The traumatized parents had already spoken. The ward records, the toxicology reports, the shift logs, all of it spoke. The court would eventually hear every word. The gap between Bueno's arrest in November 2005 and his trial was a long one. A grinding, procedural stretch of time that the families of the victims were required to endure while the machinery of the Brazilian justice system processed the evidence and prepared its case. By the time the trial commenced and moved toward its conclusion, it was 2008. Nearly 3 years had passed since the night Abreu José Bueno was taken from the hospital ward where he had carried out his killings. 3 years is a long time to carry the weight of what those families knew. Judge Valeria Caldi presided over the proceedings with the measured authority that a case of this magnitude required. The prosecution presented its case methodically, building from the forensic evidence outward, establishing first what the toxicology confirmed, then layering the shift records and the statistical pattern of incidents, then calling witnesses who placed Bueno at the center of each crisis. The picture that assembled itself in the courtroom was not subtle. It was direct. It was thoroughly documented. The defense attempted what defenses in such cases typically attempt. Challenges to the statistical methodology, questions about the conclusiveness of the toxicological findings, suggestions that alternative explanations had not been sufficiently explored. In a ward housing critically ill children, death and crisis were not abnormal events. The defense leaned into that reality wherever it could find footing. But the footing was limited. The physical evidence of sedative overdose in the bodies of children who had not received those sedatives as part of their prescribed care was not an argument that alternative explanation could sustain. The concentration levels were not ambiguous. They were not borderline. They were the concentrations of someone who had used their medical knowledge to calculate a lethal or near-lethal dose for a small, compromised body. When the testimonies of the hospital staff were heard, careful, detailed, sometimes visibly distressing, they painted a portrait that went beyond the clinical data. These were people who had worked alongside Bueno, people who had trusted him with the same professional confidence that the families had trusted the institution as a whole. Hearing their own memories recontextualized through the lens of what had been happening was, for some of them, clearly difficult. There is something uniquely devastating about realizing that the person standing next to you, the person you had assumed shared your fundamental commitment to protecting these children, was, in fact, destroying them. The families of the 4 children who died gave testimony that is, by any standard, among the most haunting elements of this entire case. Parents who had sat beside those beds, who had watched those children fight illnesses that were already devastating enough without additional assault, who had believed, in the final hours and moments of their child's life, that what was happening was a natural, if catastrophic, progression of an existing disease, who had grieved believing one thing, and who were now sitting in a courtroom understanding something entirely different. Their child had not simply lost the battle to leukemia. Their child had not simply succumbed to the complications of AIDS. Their child had been injected with a substance designed to stop their breathing by the person whose job, whose sworn professional responsibility, was to keep them alive. The adjustment that understanding requires, the psychological reconfiguration of a grief already processed, of a death already mourned, of a loss already partially survived, is one that no support system can fully accommodate. You do not simply reframe that. You do not absorb it and move forward in any straightforward way. It reopens everything. It reopens the moment of death, the hours before it, the last time you held your child's hand. puts a new face into every memory of that final period. A face that now carries a different meaning entirely. Those testimonies shook the courtroom. They were not performances of grief. They were something far more difficult to be in the presence of. Straightforward, honest accounts from people who had been irrevocably changed and who were doing the only thing left available to them, which was to be present for the proceeding that would determine what happened to the man responsible. On May 15, 2008, Judge Valeria Caldi delivered her verdict. Guilty on 4 counts of murder. Guilty on 4 counts of attempted murder. The sentencing that followed was proportional to the number of lives taken and the number of lives assaulted, though no numerical calculation can truly map onto what was lost. Abreu Jose Bueno was sentenced to 110 years of imprisonment. 110 years. A sentence that, in its numerical enormity, is almost paradoxical. No human life spans that length, and so the number functions less as a realistic term of incarceration and more as a legal statement. It is the court saying, with as much force as its framework allows, what you did cannot be contained in smaller numbers. 110 years. For 4 dead children. For 4 more who survived what he did to them. For 15 who were targeted in total across a month that should have been like any other month in a children's hospital. Difficult, sometimes sad, but fundamentally defined by the effort to heal. Bueno was removed from the courtroom to begin serving that sentence. The hospital, the Instituto de Puricultura Martigeo Gestira, was left to reckon with what had happened within its walls. Institutions do not easily absorb the knowledge that they were used as a killing ground. There were reviews of procedure, examinations of oversight, the uncomfortable institutional audit that follows whenever a systemic failure of this nature becomes undeniable. How had the pattern been missed for as long as it was? At what point should the correlation between one nurse's shifts and the escalating frequency of crises have triggered a formal internal investigation rather than the quieter unease that built over time before finally being acted upon? These are questions without comfortable answers. They point to the ways in which trust, in a medical environment, can operate as both its greatest asset and its deepest vulnerability. The trust placed in credentialed professionals. A trust that is essential to the functioning of any healthcare institution can be exploited precisely because it is not routinely interrogated. You do not check the syringe of every nurse on every shift. You cannot. The institution does not function under that level of suspicion. And yet, what Ward D demonstrated, what the case of Abreu Jose Bueno demonstrated, is that the absence of scrutiny, when occupied by someone with predatory intent and medical knowledge, can become a corridor through which terrible things pass undetected until the damage is already done. When a case like this concludes in a courtroom, when the verdict is read and the sentence is handed down and the defendant is led away, there is a collective exhale that society performs. Justice has been done, we tell ourselves. The appropriate person has been identified, tried, and confined. The chapter has been closed. But cases involving the killing of children in hospitals do not close. Not really. Not in the ways that matter most. For the families of the 4 children who were killed by Abreu Jose Bueno, the verdict did not restore what was taken. It was necessary, it was important, but it did not return a single breath to the bodies of the children who had been silenced. It did not give back the milestones that were stolen, first days of school that never happened, voices that never deepened into adolescence, faces that remain, in every surviving photograph, exactly as small and as young as they were on the last day of their lives. The verdict was the closest the legal system could come to acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, however necessary, is not repair. The surviving children who were targeted, those who lived through the respiratory crises Bueno engineered, who were resuscitated by the very colleagues whose professional authority he had weaponized for his own performance, carry their own complicated legacy. Some were too young to retain any conscious memory of what happened to them. Others were old enough that the experience embedded itself in the body, if not in cognition. In a fearfulness around medical settings, in a particular anxiety when the familiar smell of antiseptic enters a room. Trauma does not require narrative memory to lodge itself in the nervous system. It finds other ways to stay. The staff members of Ward D, the nurses, the doctors, the support workers who moved through those corridors every day of those months, face their own reckoning. For some, the professional wound ran deep. The sense that they had been deceived, that their responses to manufactured emergencies had been used by Bueno as part of his gratification, was something that complicated not only how they thought about that period but how they approached their work going forward. Trust, once broken in that particular way, is rebuilt slowly and incompletely. In the broader landscape of nursing and medical crime, a category that exists with horrifying prevalence if you look at the documented cases across decades and countries, the case of Abreu Jose Bueno occupies a specific and instructive place. He belongs to a classification of healthcare killer driven not by financial gain, not by psychosexual compulsion, not by ideological conviction, but by what criminologists describe as the need for professional heroism. The Munchausen by proxy framework, applied here to an adult perpetrator manufacturing crises in patients rather than to the more commonly discussed dynamic of apparent manufacturing illness in a child, captures the core psychology. Create the catastrophe, then be the one who arrives at its edge looking capable and essential. It is an ego-driven crime disguised in the language of care. And its disguise is almost perfect because the gestures through which it operates. Alerting staff, appearing concerned, being present at the moment of crisis, are indistinguishable to the naked professional eye from the genuine behaviors of a good nurse. The difference is internal. The difference is in what is known. And in an environment built on the assumption that its staff share a fundamental commitment to patient welfare, the internal landscape of one person is not routinely examined. What makes Bueno's case particularly disturbing, in a category of cases already extreme in their disturbance, is the specific vulnerability of his victims. These were not random patients in a general ward. These were children already fighting for their lives, already using every biological resource they possessed just to continue, to target them, to administer a suppressive agent to a body already operating at the margins of its capacity, is to understand exactly how little additional disruption it takes to extinguish that already fragile existence. He knew that. His training guaranteed that he knew that. He chose those children not in spite of their vulnerability but because of it. Because their deaths, when they came, would be easier to absorb within the existing narrative of a ward where children died. Because the camouflage their existing conditions provided was almost total. Because a child dying of leukemia in a pediatric ward does not, at first, call for a criminal investigation. That is the cold, calculated reality beneath the emotional surface of this case. It was not impulsive. It was not frenzied or chaotic. It was deliberate, methodical, and sustained over a period of weeks by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly how unlikely it was that anyone would correctly identify the source of what was happening in time to stop it. For children were killed before anyone stopped him. 15 were targeted in the window that the investigation pieced together. One man, one trained nurse, one person who had passed through the professional credentialing process, who had been interviewed and assessed and deemed suitable for placement in a children's ward, was responsible for all of it. When the Brazilian press reported on the verdict in 2008, the language used was the language that appears whenever society confronts a crime it cannot easily categorize. Monster, inhuman, incomprehensible. These are the words we reach for when the alternative, accepting that a comprehensible human being, a person who existed within ordinary social and professional structures, chose to do this, is too uncomfortable to fully sit with. But comprehensibility does not mean excusability. Understanding the psychological mechanics that drove Abreu Jose Bueno's actions, the craving for recognition, the willingness to manufacture emergencies, the selection of the most vulnerable possible victims, does not soften what he did. It only makes it more legible. And in making it more legible, it makes it more frightening. Because what it reveals is not a creature beyond the boundaries of human psychology, but a distortion of something that exists on a spectrum. The need for recognition, the desire to be seen as capable and essential. These are not alien drives. What is alien, what is catastrophically, irreparably wrong, is the method he chose to satisfy them. He served his sentence in the Brazilian prison system. He has never, in any documented public account, offered the kind of full and honest accounting of his actions that the families deserved. The controlled composure that characterized his professional persona did not dissolve behind prison walls. What Abreu Jose Bueno thinks about, in the decades of incarceration that his 110-year sentence represents, is not something the public record can tell us. What the public record can tell us is this. For children who arrived at the Instituto de Puricultura Martigueo Gestira seeking medical care, left it in ways no parent should ever have to reckon with. The institution that was supposed to protect them failed, not through malice, not through incompetence, but through the kind of trust that every functioning institution requires and that, in this case, was catastrophically misplaced. The names of the 4 children who died are not widely circulated in the English-language documentation of this case. They are preserved, as they should be, within the private grief of the families who knew them. But they existed. They were real. They had already faced more difficulty in their short lives than many adults will encounter in full ones. And in the final chapter of those lives, they were in the care of a man who had decided that his professional standing mattered more than their breath. That is the legacy of Abreu Jose Bueno, the man in the white coat, the nurse in the children's ward, the person who called the alarms that he had set, who sat in a courtroom in 2008 and heard a judge tell him, in the language of the law, what the rest of us had already understood, that what he did was unforgivable, that the 110 years he had been given were the closest a courtroom could come to saying, "You have taken something that cannot be given back, and we will take from you the only equivalent we are able to." The lights of Ward D still burn. The hospital still stands. Somewhere, in the rotating shift of a children's ward, nurses who know this case, who studied it in their training, who heard it discussed in quiet, serious tones, carry it with them into their work, as a reminder of what vigilance means, as a reminder of what trust, poorly placed, can cost, as a reminder that the most dangerous thing in any room is not always the illness. Sometimes, in the worst and rarest and most devastating circumstances, it is the person trusted to fight it. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Maniaco de Cruz, the boy who played God with blood. The disturbing true story of Dionathan Celestrino, a.k.a. the Cross Maniac, a.k.a. Dog Hell 666. Somewhere in Brazil, a 16-year-old boy walked out of his house with a knife hidden under his clothes, a list of names in his pocket, and a god he invented in his own head. And before the year was over, 3 people were dead, posed like crucifixes in the dirt, while he slept soundly in his bed. What if the most dangerous thing in a quiet town wasn't a stranger passing through, but the quiet boy next door who smiled at your face in daylight and scribbled your name on a death list by candlelight? What if the monster wore a school uniform, kept good grades, and left handwritten notes beside the corpses he arranged with careful, deliberate hands? Notes that read like scripture and smelled like something ancient and broken. The town of Rio Brilhante, Brazil, never saw it coming. A place so small that everyone knew everyone, so ordinary that nothing terrible was supposed to survive there. But something did survive. Something slow, silent, and deeply convinced it was righteous. His name was Dionathan Celestrino. He called himself Dog Hell 666 on the internet. The media eventually called him O Maniaco de Cruz, the Cross Maniac. And by the time authorities understood what was happening in that town, 3 people were already dead, each one stripped of their clothing, each one positioned with arms spread wide and legs crossed at the ankles, the unmistakable shape of a cross, each one left like a message written in flesh for a god that only Celestrino could hear. This is that story. Every word of it is real. Every body was real. Every note he left behind was real. And somewhere in Brazil right now, he is still breathing, still incarcerated, still studying, still receiving family visits, because the law could only give him so many years. Stay with me. Rio Brilhante is a municipality in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, Brazil. The name translates loosely to Bright River. And in many ways, that name is almost cruel in its irony, because what grew inside that town in the year 2008 was anything but bright. It was something festering. Something that had been growing for years in a quiet bedroom, behind closed curtains, fed by obsession, fed by ideology, fed by a teenager who had decided that he alone had been chosen to cleanse the world of people he deemed unworthy. Dionathan Celestrino was born on January 5, 1992. That made him 16 years old when the first body turned up in a vacant lot on the 2nd of July, 2008. 16. Still legally a child. Still a student. Still someone's son. And yet, behind the face of a quiet, introspective boy who teachers described as reserved and decent with his grades, there was a mind constructing a theology that most adults would never dare to think, let alone act upon. From early in his adolescence, Celestrino had developed an unusual set of fascinations. He did not collect the things most teenage boys collect. He was drawn to darkness in ways that went beyond teenage rebellion or gothic aesthetics. He slept in cemeteries, not once, not as a dare, but regularly, as though the dead gave him comfort that the living could not. He developed a morbid obsession with blood, with suffering, with the mechanics of death. He became consumed by necrophilia in both theory and fantasy, fixated on bodies and what happened to them when the soul left. He formed a small cult of Satan worshippers, positioning himself as their leader, wearing that authority the way some boys wear sports jerseys, naturally, without hesitation. In school, he was quiet. He bullied black students, calling them inferior. He sat alone more than he sat with others. He was the kind of person whose presence made a room feel slightly colder, not because he was loud or disruptive, but because there was something behind his eyes that people couldn't name and didn't want to look at too long. His teachers noted his good behavior in the academic sense, but something about him never settled comfortably into the ordinary. At some point during these years, Celestrino discovered Francisco de Assis Pereira, known across Brazil as the Park Maniac, one of the country's most notorious serial killers. Most teenagers who learn about serial killers develop a morbid curiosity and move on. Celestrino did not move on. He kept a poster of Pereira on his bedroom wall. He studied him. He admired him. He decided, with the kind of calm, rational conviction that is more frightening than any rage, that Pereira was both his idol and his competition. He wanted to surpass him. He wanted to kill more people. He wanted to be remembered the way Pereira was remembered, feared the way Pereira was feared. This was not fantasy. This was ambition. Dark, calculated, murderous ambition living inside a teenage boy who rode to school every morning and sat in a classroom and said nothing to reveal what burned behind his silence. His online life exposed another face entirely. On Orkut, the social media platform dominant in Brazil at the time, he operated under the handle Cachorro do Inferno 666, which translates to Dog of Hell 666. His profile was not hidden. It was not encrypted. It was simply there, in a username, in a worldview, in the digital fingerprint of a boy who had already decided what he was going to do. He communicated with people. He interacted with strangers. He knew how to present himself as normal enough to be tolerated, even while the philosophy taking shape inside him was anything but normal. The theology he built for himself was a warped, violent hybrid, part neo-paganism, part religious moralism, part personal vendetta against a world he believed was spiritually corrupt. He called himself a goth. He called himself a religious thinker. He read about gods and myths and rituals. And somewhere in all that reading and all that dark wandering through cemeteries and all those late nights online as Dog Hell 666, he arrived at a conclusion that terrified no one because no one knew he'd arrived at it. People who did not follow God's precepts deserved to die. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally, in blood, by his hand. He designed a ritual, a screening process, a method. He would approach a potential victim, chosen at random, and ask them first whether they believed in God. If they said yes, he moved forward. He then asked them a series of deeply personal, sexually related questions. What age had they lost their virginity? How many partners had they had? What was their sexual preference? He was running an interrogation disguised as conversation, a tribunal disguised as small talk. If he decided, based on their answers, based on his own twisted measure of purity, that they were impure, that they had sinned, that they did not meet the standard of the God in his head, he would take them somewhere isolated. And he would kill them. After the killing, he had a ritual for the body too. He would strip them, removing clothing, leaving them exposed. He would then arrange the corpse with the arms spread wide and the legs crossed at the ankles overlapping, the body transformed into the unmistakable shape of a crucifix. A cross laid flat on the ground. His signature, his message, his sacrament. What made this even more chilling was the psychological profile that would eventually emerge after his arrest. A psychologist who interviewed him directly told investigators that Celestrino did not kill his victims primarily for religious reasons. Not at the core of it. He killed to watch them suffer. The religion was a framework, a costume draped over a far rawer appetite. He was not a true believer executing divine will. He was someone who enjoyed the act of taking life and had constructed a belief system that gave him permission to do it, even made it feel righteous. The ideology was a key, not a cause. And with that key, in 2008, he began to open doors. By the time Rio Brillante realized there was a killer moving through it, the first body was already weeks old, decaying in the summer heat of a Brazilian July, arranged like a saint on an invisible altar in a vacant lot that nobody wanted to walk past anymore. The town would not sleep easy again for months, but Celestrino slept fine. He always slept fine. That's the detail that stays with you longest. Not the crosses, not the notes, not the names on the list. The fact that he went home afterward. He had dinner. He got into his bed. He closed his eyes. And the next morning he woke up and waited, quietly, patiently, for the moment he would do it again. July 2nd, 2008. The heat in Rio Brillante that time of year is oppressive. Thick, pressing, the kind of heat that makes every smell more intense, every shadow more welcome. It was on this kind of night that Dionathan Celestrino found his first victim. The man's name was Catalino Gardina. He was 33 years old. He worked as a bricklayer, a mason, a working man with rough hands and the particular tiredness that physical labor leaves in the bones. He was also Celestrino's neighbor. They knew each other in that way that neighbors in small towns know each other. By sight, by proximity, by the kind of casual acknowledgement that doesn't require intimacy. Celestrino had clearly been watching him, had made his assessment, had decided that Catalino Gardina was impure and, by his theological framework, therefore forfeit. What Celestrino later said to investigators was clinical in its cruelty. Gardina deserved to die because he was an alcoholic and a homosexual. Those were the charges. Those were the sins. A man who drank too much and loved differently from what Celestrino approved of. And for that, Catalino Gardina was sentenced to death by a teenage neighbor who had appointed himself both judge and executioner. The method was not quick. It was not merciful. Celestrino stabbed him. A precise, devastating blow to the chest, to the heart, and then wrapped a plastic bag around his head, suffocating the life that remained. The combination of the two, the blade and the suffocation, tells you something about the nature of the act. This was not a panicked attack. This was deliberate. This was sequential. He was in control of every step. After Gardina died, Celestrino undressed the body. He then arranged it in the position he had planned, arms out, legs crossed at the ankles, forming the shape of a cross in the dirt of a vacant lot. Near the body, he placed a handwritten note. On it were the 4 letters, I-N-R-I, the Latin abbreviation for Jesus Nazarenus, Rex Iudiorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The inscription placed on the cross above Christ during the crucifixion. He was not just killing. He was staging a blasphemous theology, playing out a dark liturgy in real flesh and real blood under the Brazilian night sky. When Gardina's body was discovered, the town reacted with the shock that always comes before understanding. Police launched an investigation. They had no concrete leads. The Poe's body was disturbing, the religious marking deeply strange, but without context, without a pattern, there was still the possibility that this was isolated. Terrible, yes, but isolated. It was not isolated. 53 days later, on August 24, 2008, Celestrino struck again. The second victim was Leticia Neves de Oliveira. She was 22 years old, a young woman who worked as a gas station attendant. She was gay. That fact, by Celestrino's warped calculus, made her impure, a violation of the precepts he believed in with lethal sincerity. On the night of August 24th, Leticia was walking to meet friends. It was an ordinary night. She had plans. She had somewhere to be. She had no reason to know that she was being watched, that someone nearby had already asked himself his ritual questions about her and arrived at the verdict that she should not live. Celestrino approached her and forced her at knife point to accompany him to a location that was, by design, isolated. He took her to a cemetery, the place where he had slept as a child, the place he found comfort among the dead. He took her there, and he strangled her with his bare hands. Manually, personally. He put his hands around her throat and squeezed until she was gone. Her body was found not far from her home, laid on top of a grave that already belonged to someone else, and now bore the weight of a second death. Arms out, legs crossed at the ankles, the same cross, the same position, the same unmistakable message. She was found partially unclothed. The cemetery location, the pose, the method, everything screamed that this was connected to the first murder. Police could no longer say this was isolated. The word serial entered the conversation. The word that changes everything in a small town. The word that means no one is safe, that it could happen again, that something is moving through your community and you don't know its face. Panic settled over Rio Brillante like a second heat. People whispered. People warned each other. Mothers told their children not to walk alone. Young women changed their routines. The population was frightened in that particular way that small communities become frightened. Deeply, collectively, personally. Because in a town that size, 2 murders felt like a war. But the boy who caused all of it moved through the panic like a ghost through walls. He went about his days. He attended to whatever he attended to. He checked his Orkut profile as Dog Hell 666. He watched the fear rise in the town around him and felt, presumably, the satisfaction of someone whose message was being received. Because that is what these scenes were for him. Messages. Art. Scripture. He had also, by this point, begun keeping trophies. In his bedroom, the bedroom with the poster of the park maniac on the wall, Celestrino had started collecting. He kept newspaper clippings about the murders. He kept a handwritten paper with his victims' names and the dates of their deaths. Next to each name he had killed, he wrote the word dead. He kept a bracelet belonging to Leticia de Oliveira. He would later acquire more items from his third victim. This was not the behavior of someone tortured by guilt or troubled by what he had done. This was the behavior of someone who was proud, someone who was building a record, someone who was keeping score. Because he was keeping score. Against Pereira. Against Brazil's most notorious killer. He wanted more victims. He wanted a higher count. He was 16 years old, and he was measuring himself against a serial killer's body count with the kind of competitive focus most teenagers reserve for sports statistics. He waited exactly 39 more days. Then, on October 3, 2008, Jonathan Celestrino went out again. The third victim was Gleice Kelly da Silva. She was 13 years old. 13. A child. Gleice was a young girl who, by accounts, was a drug user, and that detail, by Celestrino's tribunal of purity, sealed her fate. She had violated his standards. She was not worthy of life. He found her on a night when, despite warnings that had spread through the community about a possible killer, she had left her home. The encounter followed the same dark architecture as the previous 2. He isolated her. He killed her. Her body was found at an abandoned construction site, partially unclothed, arranged in the cross position. But this time, Celestrino left a different note. Written by hand, placed beside the child's body, the note read, "Dead man does not respond to messages." It was an online reference, pulled from the language of Orkut, the social platform where the dead cannot reply to comments left on their profiles. He had already, by this point, gone onto Gleice's Orkut profile as Dog Hell 666 and left a comment there. Digital evidence. Physical evidence. A knife still in his house. Trophies still in his room. The list of names still in his possession. He had also, in a detail that reveals something almost incomprehensible about his state of mind, written one more name on that paper, a name beside which he did not write dead. He wrote saved. It was Carla, a girl who had been approached by Celestrino on a night she should not have been outside, who had encountered him and survived, either through luck, through the appearance of others nearby, or through some flicker of restraint in him that even he could not explain. He had included her on his list. He had considered her. He had decided, for reasons unknown, to let her live. And he had written it down, organized, methodical, terrifyingly calm. The third murder was the one that forced the police to form a dedicated task force. The police in Rio Brillante were not unprepared investigators. They understood, by the time Gleese Kelly da Silva's body was found on October 3, 2008, that they were dealing with something systematic. The linked modus operandi was undeniable: 3 victims, 3 cross arrangements, 3 crime scenes connected by the same ritual logic. A special unit was formed. The pressure from the community was immense. People were genuinely afraid, and investigators knew that whoever this was, they were not finished. The early phase of the investigation was conducted without a clear suspect. Celestrino's name entered the picture initially because of something straightforward: geography. He was Catalino Gardina's neighbor. That made him a person of interest in the first murder by default. Investigators canvassed neighbors, asked questions, looked for anyone who might have known the first victim well enough to target him specifically. Celestrino was interviewed. He answered their questions. He gave them nothing. He was a quiet 16-year-old who appeared cooperative, and in the absence of any direct evidence at that stage, the investigation moved on. But then Gleese Kelly da Silva was murdered, and Gleese had an Orkut account, and someone had left a comment on it after her death. Something dark, something that felt less like a grieving acquaintance and more like an author signing his work. The account that left that comment was registered under the name Cachorro do Inferno 666, Dog of Hell 666. Investigators began working to trace the Orkut account. Digital forensics in 2008 was a different landscape than it is today, but the principle was the same. An account has a history. An account connects to an email address. An email address connects to an identity. The trail was there, waiting to be followed, and investigators followed it with increasing certainty that the quiet neighbor who had already been interviewed once was not as quiet as he appeared. On October 9, 2008, 6 days after the murder of Gleese Kelly da Silva, 7 days after she had been left at that construction site like a discarded message, police obtained a search warrant for the home of Dionathan Celestrino. What they found inside his room dissolved any remaining doubt. The knife was there. It would later be tested and found to carry traces consistent with the crimes. The newspaper clippings were there. The articles about the murders that he had been following with the attention of someone tracking their own performance. The personal items belonging to his victims were there. A bracelet from Leticia de Oliveira, the phone belonging to Gleese Kelly da Silva, and then there was the paper, the list of names, written by hand, with dates. The dead listed as dead. Carla listed as saved. A document as orderly and matter-of-fact as a planner, as a checklist, as a to-do list for someone whose tasks involved killing. On the wall, the poster of Francisco de Assis Pereira stared down at the room. The park maniac, the idol, the rival. Celestrino had intended to surpass him. He had 3 confirmed kills and at least 1 surviving target. He had not yet come close to Pereira's numbers, but the intent was clear. He was building toward something. The arrest on October 9th stopped the clock. Celestrino was taken into custody. He was 16 years old. He was, by the account of investigators, calm. Cooperative in the way someone is cooperative when they've already made peace with the outcome, when the capture was simply the next event in a narrative they'd always known would eventually arrive. He did not break down. He did not rage. He answered questions with the steady flatness of someone who had already processed their own guilt and replaced it with something that felt, to him, like righteousness. He told investigators that he killed his victims because they did not follow God's precepts. He laid it out clearly. Catalino Gardina, an alcoholic and a homosexual, unworthy of life. Leticia de Oliveira, a lesbian, impure. Glees Kelly da Silva, a drug user, fallen. By his theology, each of them had failed the test. By his theology, he had administered the appropriate sentence. He spoke without the tortured language of remorse. He spoke the way someone speaks when they believe they were right. The cross arrangements, the INRI note, the cemetery location, all of it was his statement, his sermon. He was not leaving crime scenes, he was building altars. He was not killing randomly, he was executing a doctrine. The ritual was everything. The message was everything. He had choreographed 3 separate murders, each one placed in a location designed to be found, each body positioned to be read, each note left like a verse from a gospel that only he understood. The psychological evaluation that followed his arrest produced a finding that investigators expected but still found chilling. Normal in basic cognition, but with schizophrenic tendencies. A subsequent, more detailed psychological report went further. Celestrino presented with severe sociopathy. The word sociopathy covers a great deal of ground, but in his case it translated to something specific. No empathy, no remorse, no internal mechanism that registered the suffering of others as relevant to his own choices. He was capable of functioning. He was capable of charm. He was capable of academic achievement and social mimicry, but he was not capable or willing of caring that 3 people were dead because of him. The psychologist was unambiguous in the assessment delivered to authorities. If Jonathan Celestrino were ever released from prison, he would almost certainly kill again. This was not opinion. This was clinical evaluation. The report stated directly that he posed a future danger to society that was not theoretical. It was probable, perhaps inevitable, and underneath it all, underneath the theology, underneath the ritualism, underneath the ideology about God's precepts, was the psychologist's most disturbing finding. He had not killed because he truly believed in the divine mission he described. He had killed because he enjoyed watching people suffer. The religion was a structure, a permission slip, a frame around a canvas that had always been painted in violence. Strip away the crosses, strip away the notes, strip away the INRI inscriptions and the neo-pagan philosophy, and what remained was an appetite for cruelty that had been there long before the theology arrived to explain it. He was 16 years old, and he was incapable of being moved by the death of others. He slept in cemeteries for comfort. He worshipped the memory of a serial killer. He measured his ambition in corpses. And when the police came to his door, he let them in. Because in some part of him, the chapter was already complete, the message already sent, and whatever came next was simply the next chapter. The arrest of Jonathan Celestrino on October 9, 2008, did not close the wound in Rio Brillante. It sealed it over the way scar tissue seals a wound, covering it, yes, but leaving the mark forever. A town that small does not recover from 3 ritualistic murders in the span of 3 months. The faces of Catalino Gardina, Leticia Neves de Oliveira, and Glees Kelly da Silva, a 33-year-old bricklayer, a 22-year-old gas station attendant, a 13-year-old girl, remained in the community's consciousness long after the police tape came down and the crime scenes were cleaned. For their families, there was no cleanliness. There was the unbearable particular grief of violent, senseless loss. The kind of grief that has nowhere to go because the question why has an answer that only makes it worse. Their loved ones had not been killed by accident. They had not been killed in passion. They had been selected, evaluated, condemned by a teenager with a list, and killed as part of a ritual whose meaning existed only in the killer's head. That is a different category of grief. It doesn't diminish with time the way ordinary grief does. Calcifies. The legal proceedings against Celestrino were complicated from the outset by one fundamental fact. He was 16. In Brazil, the age of criminal majority is 18. A minor cannot be tried as an adult under Brazilian law, regardless of the severity of the crime. This meant that the formal criminal prosecution, the one with adult penalties, with decades of incarceration, with the full weight of the legal system, would have to wait until he came of age. In the interim, he was placed in a juvenile detention facility. The community's reaction to this was predictable and entirely human. Rage, frustration, the feeling that the law was protecting someone who had shown no interest in protecting anyone. 3 people were dead. A child's body had been left at a construction site with a mocking note beside it. And the person responsible was 16 and therefore shielded by an age that felt, in this context, grotesquely inadequate. But the law did not bend. It applied. And Celestrino served his juvenile sentence while the clock ticked toward the age at which he could be tried properly. When the adult trial finally came, the proceedings were conducted with the full weight of the evidence gathered in October 2008. The knife, the trophies, the list, the Orkut account, the digital trail, the confession, delivered in that steady, unrepentant tone, the psychological reports. The surviving victim, Carla, who had lived because something in him had chosen not to complete what he started. All of it was laid out. He was convicted on all 3 counts of murder. The sentence was substantial. The reports indicate a conviction that amounted to 48 years, a sentence that accounted for the triple murders and the aggravating circumstances of the ritualistic nature and the age of one victim. He is currently incarcerated at the Campo Grande Penal Institution in Campo Grande, Mato Grosso do Sul, and the psychological reports that deemed him a future danger to society ensured that he has remained there, without a release date, under a status that reflects the court's recognition that some sentences are not about rehabilitation. They are about protection, about the certainty that what he is, and what he was capable of at 16, would not diminish with years inside a cell. And yet, the details of his incarceration reveal something that still unsettles people who follow this case closely. He is described by prison officials as a good inmate, cooperative, well-behaved. He receives regular visits from family members. He is currently enrolled in a university program, studying environmental resource management. He has attempted to appeal various convictions and charges. He has filed legal motions. He functions efficiently, quietly, without outward drama, within the system that holds him. This is not unusual for sociopaths in structured environments. The same qualities that allowed him to appear normal to his teachers, to be cooperative with the first police interview, to walk through a panicked town without attracting suspicion. Those same qualities serve him inside prison walls. He adapts. He presents. He behaves well because behaving well costs him nothing and accomplishes what compliance accomplishes in any enclosed system. Reduced scrutiny, improved conditions, the appearance of progress. The psychological profile established at the time of his arrest has not been revised in any direction that might suggest he has changed. The clinical judgment remains what it was. This is someone whose sociopathy is structural, not situational. He did not become dangerous because of his circumstances in 2008. The danger is embedded. And the courts have treated that assessment seriously enough to keep him confined despite appeals. Carla, the surviving victim, the one listed as saved on his handwritten ledger, lived with the particular burden of being the one he chose not to kill. No public record can fully account for what that means to a person, to be on a killer's list with your name written in a different column. She was spared by the arbitrary mercy of someone who had no mercy. And yet the fact that he spared her tells you something about the control he had, the deliberation. He could have killed her. He chose not to. He wrote it down. That choice was as calculated as every murder. Nothing he did was impulsive. Everything had a reason that lived inside his framework, legible only to him. The digital ghost of Dog Hell 666 still exists in the archived corners of the internet. Old social media fragments, screenshots, documentation that researchers and true crime followers have preserved as evidence of the person he was before the arrests, before the trials, before the prison. The username remains, in its way, the most honest self-portrait he ever offered. A dog. Hell. The number of the beast. He was not hiding. He was announcing. The world just didn't know how to read the announcement until it was too late for 3 people. In Brazil, his case has been documented, debated, adapted. A film adaptation has been discussed. Podcasts and documentary content have covered him extensively. He exists in the true crime conversation as a case study in what radicalized, unchecked adolescent ideology can produce when it collides with a complete absence of empathy and a desire for notoriety. He is studied by criminologists. He is referenced in discussions of juvenile crime, of sociopathy, of the relationship between online identity and real-world violence. But in Rio Brillante, in Mato Grosso do Sul, the conversation is different. It is quieter and more personal. There are people in that town who knew Catalino Gardina, who worked with him, who drank with him, who watched him die in absentia through the details of a police report. There are people who knew Leticia de Oliveira and remember her laugh, remember the way she moved through the gas station, remember what she was wearing the last time they saw her. There are people who remember Glees Kelly da Silva the way you remember a child, in fragments, in the particular tenderness that 13 years old carries, the awkward threshold between childhood and the person she might have become. She might have become someone extraordinary. She might have been ordinary in the beautiful, irreplaceable way all ordinary people are irreplaceable. She was 13. She had not finished becoming anything. And Dionathan Celestrino, who had read about gods and death and serial killers and decided he was qualified to determine who deserved to live, put his hands on her and ended it, left her at a construction site with a note about dead people not answering messages. There are things that case files cannot hold. The weight of Leticia's bracelet in Celestrino's drawer. The silence at Glees' dinner table in October 2008. The moment Catalino Gardina's family learned that their son, their brother, their neighbor, had been stabbed in the heart and suffocated by someone he had lived beside. The specific shape of that grief in that town, in that heat. The crosses he arranged were meant to say something. He had a message. He wanted it received. He got his notoriety eventually. His poster on the wall beside the Park Maniacs, replaced now by something grimmer. His name in true crime databases, in psychological case studies, in the digital archive of violence that Brazil's judiciary system maintains. He is known. O Maniaco de Cruz, the Cross Maniac, Dog Hell 666. And the 3 people he killed are also known, because this story will not allow them to be forgotten. Catalino Gardina, Leticia Neves de Oliveira, Glees Kelly da Silva. Their names do not belong to him. They belong to themselves, to the people who loved them, to the town that lost them, to the record that must always outlast the killer's legend. Rio Brillante, Brazil, July to October 2008. 3 crosses in the ground. 3 people gone. 1 teenage boy incarcerated for life, studying environmental management, receiving family visits, filing appeals, behaving well. And the question that every case like this leaves behind, echoing long after the verdict and the sentence and the prison cell. What do you do with someone who is not sorry, who was never sorry, who built a world inside his own mind where what he did made perfect sense, and who, if given the chance, would do it again? You keep the door locked. You keep it locked because the psychologist said so, because the evidence said so, because 3 people who cannot speak for themselves said so with the weight of everything their absence left behind. The door stays locked. That is the only answer Rio Brillante ever got. And for a town that buried its dead and tried to forget the summer that changed it, it would have to be enough. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.